All right, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richman, the vice president of the foundation. And this is the Libertarian Angle, the show, as you know, that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. The perspective that you're certainly not going to find on your Sunday morning talk shows or in your mainstream op-ed pages and editorial pages. This is the show that brings you the libertarian perspective. And Sheldon, I guess it's been about a year now. We're celebrating our one-year anniversary for the Libertarian Angle. This is our last show of the year. And so it's been great working with you this past year.
I've had a great time. It's I hope the listeners, the viewers enjoy it. I'm certainly enjoying it.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. And I thought what we would discuss today is the Postal Service's infamous, of course, never-ending price hikes. They've announced, I think it's a 3 cent on the first-class mail postage, 3 cent increase. But what's really funny this time is they're saying it's temporary. I mean, like, what do they take us for? That it's supposed to last only 2 years, and it's just designed, excuse me, to make up their, $3 billion shortfall or something. And they promise that after 2 years, they're going to go back to the old rate. It's got to be the most ridiculous thing in the world. I mean, why is it that we're still living under this dinosaur monopoly? I mean, it's just so incredible. This is your classic case of a monopoly. And it has all the characteristics of a monopoly, abusive attitude, arrogant attitude, always raising prices. Why can't we just get rid of this thing once and for all, Sheldon?
Because of vested interests. It's the same answer for all these things. You got people who make huge amount of money off it, and they're not about to give it up, and they plead that they're able to plead that it's in the public interest and that rural areas need it, and things would be terrible if it were to go away. So most people aren't thinking about it that often. Their mail shows up, and they're just not thinking about it. And if there's a couple of pennies increase in postage, they shrug their shoulders. They wish it didn't happen, but what are you going to do? And so they don't care much about it. The people that care and that will lobby and spend all their time protecting the bureaucracy are the people who make money off it, the people who run it, the people who work for it, and I think we're stuck with it for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, your point about the rural areas is really funny because, we always grow up hearing this, well, how would people in the mountains get their mail if the Postal Service wasn't around? But somehow or another, the people in the mountains get their milk, and they get their food, and they get other essentials of life, and you don't have the government delivering those kind of things. I mean, you're right. We've become so dependent on these kind of systems. And this is, a status system par excellence. And people just say, oh, my gosh, how would I live without the Postal Service? Just like, the rest of the welfare state, the warfare state. And the idea that you could have a society that's delivering mail through the free market is just a frightening notion, especially the status. It's like, oh my gosh, what would happen if the free market were delivering mail? Well, I'll tell you what would happen. Be the greatest system in the world. The free market produces the best of everything. I mean, we rely on it for most other aspects of our lives. I mean, granted, we don't live in a free market society. It's highly regulated, highly controlled, highly subsidized. But in those areas where you have vestiges of free markets, grocery stores and FedEx and so forth, you can see the virtues of a free market. And I think it's important, Sheldon, also that we go back and we address exactly what is it that makes this a monopoly. Because we all grew up, with economics classes and stuff, with that big business is a monopoly, U.S. Steel's a monopoly, or what was that favorite term we learned in our econ classes? Oligopolies. That was a funny one. But really, a monopoly is only a business that the government makes it illegal to compete against. That's what vests it with a monopoly power. So nobody can compete against the Postal Service. It has a privileged position in society, and that privileged position comes not because it's satisfying consumers. It comes because the law will shut down anybody who tries to compete in the delivery of first-class mail.
Yeah, it went to ridiculous lengths, a few years ago, 10 years ago or more, when the postal authorities were raiding companies and accusing them of sending by FedEx things that were not urgent. Because you might ask, well, why is FedEx allowed to compete, or UPS allowed to compete with not in packages but in flat stuff? Why are they allowed to compete with the post office? Well, they're not allowed to compete in first class mail, and so they would raid companies and look at their stuff, look at their records, and claim that, well, you're not allowed to send bills that have 30-day terms as first-class mail, as overnight, because that's not urgent. If you're telling the person who's got 30 days, the bill does not have to be delivered overnight. And so they were hit with we might think it's a fine, but it wasn't a fine. They didn't call it a fine. They called it postage due. In other words, they deprived, by sending bills by FedEx, which did not need to be there overnight, they were depriving the Postal Service of the postage. So those companies got hit with back postage. Enough of those companies had clout and complained to their senators that the post office, they called off the post office. They passed a law or somehow they stopped them from doing that. So I don't believe they do that anymore. But that took enough companies with clout to complain to their senators that hey, we're getting raided by postal authorities demanding to see our records, and they're challenging our claim that this piece of mail is urgent. They're saying, no, it's not urgent, therefore you have to send it with us. You can't send it with FedEx. So the theory is pretty ridiculous. So it does make the claim that it has this monopoly on first class mail, and so only super urgent stuff. This exception's been carved out with FedEx and the other companies for overnight. Why they gave that up, I'm not sure. I don't know the story behind that. That'd be interesting to know why they even lost that little bit of their business. Probably because everybody knew that no way the post office should get something overnight.
Yeah, well, on the small people, there's been histories of teenagers that establish businesses in the middle of cities to deliver mail for businesses. And immediately, they don't have the clout that FedEx has and the UPS and the rest of the big companies. So immediately, the Postal Service runs to the Justice Department. They go to a federal judge and get an immediate injunction, shut down a group of teenagers that are just trying to make a little bit of extra money, satisfying consumers, competing against the Postal Service. They shut them down immediately. And then the judge lectures them that this is a monopoly. You can't do this. The law prohibits you from doing this. And if you go back in the history of English monopolies, there was tremendous resentment, especially in the age of mercantilism, against British monopolies. They were abusive. Their products were shoddy. They weren't very nice to people. And there was tremendous recoil among the British people against monopolies. And there's a long history of that. And yet there's still vestiges of this. And the Postal Service is the prime example of this. Again, it is a law that prohibits competition. And I find it interesting, Sheldon, that the leftists are always complaining about, big business, they're like monopolies and so forth. But you never see a leftist saying, let's ditch the Postal Service. It's like this is their one of their little sacred cows, it seems like to me.
Well, of course, they make an exception for government. They don't mind that government is a monopoly. And one of the things they point to, which gets back to the discussion of the rural locations, is they think there's sort of a right to have mail delivered at this, even though you're a great distance from the origin of it, have it delivered at the same low price as, sending mail across town. And so, the idea is that, private mail delivery won't assure that if you live out in the sticks somewhere really far from any urban area, that you're going to be able to pay, that postage will cost you as low as it costs somebody living in New York City who's sending something to someone else in New York City. But, why shouldn't the price reflect the distance and the cost that the company has to undergo to send it. It's an irrational demand that the price be a flat rate no matter where it's going. And I mean, competition may somehow bring that about, but there's no reason to have the government guarantee that. And so that's one thing. But you're right, they don't complain about the government because it's the government. Another thing we should mention here is that I know that the Postal Service is the Postal Union is often on TV claiming they don't get a dime of taxpayer money. But of course, they've been bailed out many times in the past because they run a chronic deficit, and once in a while, Congress steps in and either lends them money, of course, at very low interest, or gives them an outright grant. So I think that's a dishonest commercial when they come on and say we don't get a dime. Of course, they do hit you occasionally with a postage increase. And like you say, we're going to get this, 3-cent increase. They promise will only last 2 years, and I'm as skeptical about that as you are. Let's remember that the telephone tax that came in the Spanish-American War didn't get repealed until I think this century. It's pretty recent, so that was a temporary tax too. But this idea that it's going to go up 3 cents, I'm reminded of an editorial cartoon some years ago when it went up a couple of pennies, and the slogan of it's like 3 cents more to mail a first class letter, and the post office slogan was still just a penny a day. So I guess we can take comfort in the fact that it's still just a penny a day.
Well, there's two ways to go about this. I mean, one would be repeal the postal monopoly and leave the Postal Service in existence. In other words, open it up to competition from the private sector. I mean, if they're as confident as they profess to be about what good service they're providing and how they're satisfying consumers with their nice little postage stamps and stuff, why not just open it up to competition? Let's just see what happens. Well, I'll tell you what would happen. The private sector would put them out of business, maybe not instantaneously, but pretty soon. The Postal Service would be out of business. But my feeling is, like, this is not a legitimate role of government. There's absolutely no reason why government should be providing mail delivery any more than it should be providing food delivery or educational services or any other of these private sector peaceful products and services. And so I would say repeal the post monopoly and get the government totally out of the mail delivery service. You don't need it. Let the private sector handle this, where people are responding, and entrepreneurs are entering the market, coming up with ideas that we can't even imagine on the delivery of mail, and just let the market handle it, let consumers handle it. Why can't we just look at postal delivery the way we look at the other aspects of our lives that we let the free market handle?
Well, I'll come up with a big reason right now. It's not an honorable reason, but it's a reason. Apart from the patronage and the other financial interests some people have in the system, the government has always wanted to have a hand in the mail. This is true of any country, I think, because that way it could read the mail. It could, in other words, violate our privacy, and the U.S. government has done that over the years. It's done it during world wars. It's done it between wars. It's done it whenever some matter is heated up and there's grave national security concern. Quotation marks around that. So if they're not controlling the mail, it might be tougher. Now, it's not impossible. We know that they're getting emails, and the government doesn't deliver email, so that they can still prevail on private companies to get a hold of it. But how much easier is it to monitor people's mail if the government's delivering the mail? So of course they don't want to give it up, no matter what good arguments we come up with.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we can see that with the NSA scandal. I mean, they want to know what everybody's doing, and my feeling is that the real reason they want all this information is to keep the citizenry in line. That they, like Hoover used to try to discover the personal secrets of people so that he could blackmail them, keep them in line, make sure that they voted his way, like in Congress, and that's the real purpose that they read people's mail. This notion of, we got to keep the nation safe and the national security is part of the whole national security apparatus. It's all nonsense. It's a way to keep their entrenched power intact. And by reading people's mail, reading their email, and so forth, it's part of this surveillance society where you learn people's secrets, and then that way you keep them in line. I think you hit the nail on the head on this thing.
Yeah, we also, of course, have to mention Lysander Spooner, one of the great heroes in this on this subject. In the mid-19th century, he set up a company to compete with the post office and was delivering mail between New York and Boston, I believe. Way out competing the post office, was charging much less, was gathering business, was building a successful firm, and of course, then the government the Congress passed laws, maybe the first laws against the private express statutes, which forbade competition of first-class mail, and they shut down Spooner. So among Spooner's many great achievements is challenging the government mail monopoly.
Well, let's compare the private sector big business syndrome that leftists often bring up with the Postal Service, because we often hear that, from the left, that, these big businesses, Google or Microsoft or U.S. Steel, that these are monopolies. That now we both would agree, Sheldon, that there's all kinds of economic regulations and bailouts and so forth that assist many of these companies in their rise to success. And certainly as libertarians, we would never defend that. And we condemn corporatism and the bailouts and so forth. But if we talk in terms of what the libertarian ideal is, and that is a separation of economy and the state, where there is no crony capitalism, there's no subsidies, there's no economic regulations protecting businesses and their position in the market. And we just talk in terms of what Ludwig von Mises called an unhampered market economy. Then if a business gets big, isn't that just a reflection that they have done well in satisfying consumers? I mean, it seems to me that that's the only way that they can succeed at that point, by offering consumers for sale something that consumers are willing to pay for. I mean, if you take Microsoft and you eliminate all the extraneous stuff, the regulations and stuff, this is a company that got big and successful because it provided a product that made people's lives better, that they were willing to pay for. And so to me, that's a totally different concept when you have a huge company that is big and successful as a result of consumer sovereignty, as compared to an enterprise like the Postal Service that's big as a result of an illegally established monopoly that prohibits people from competing against it. Because in the private sector, if the big company doesn't continue satisfying consumers, it ultimately goes out of business. It doesn't matter how big it is. That it will start losing market share if it doesn't satisfy consumers. And it seems to me that people on the left just don't get that distinction between the unhampered market economy and consumer sovereignty and the postal monopoly, where the government's keeping them in this privileged, exalted position.
Well, I would distinguish the free market theory, which I think is entirely valid, from the historical practice, which I think is rather different. So it's true that in the United States, the government doesn't outlaw, in most cases, Postal being one example, doesn't outlaw competition, but it does things to suppress competition, whether by intention or by unintended consequence. But sometimes, a lot of times, it's by intention. In other words, to help establish companies and keep them, sound. They're able to lobby and get politicians, get politicians to enact measures that suppress new competition, or make it harder for a small company to grow or a company to get into business in the first place. Regulation, taxation, I would add intellectual property into that, patents. But there's a whole host of things: land use regulations, interstate highways, the way they charge for damage to the highways. There's a long list of things. So while that doesn't totally destroy competition and let a company just go on forever, even if it's not serving consumers very well, it certainly, to a very large extent, deadens the sensitivity of the system to attentiveness to customers and to consumers. And so companies get bigger, I think, than they would in a really free market, and then can be a little more neglectful of consumers than they could be in a really free market. So I think you do find the effects even among the major companies like steel and software, and computers, and a whole lot of other things, transportation. So that's why we want to get rid of those things that are considered, cronyist, corporatist, That we want to get rid of those things in order to restore the sensitivity, the hypersensitivity to consumers that businesses would have to show if they had, couldn't face bailouts, couldn't get the government to throw roadblocks in the way of competitors, new competitors, or people who are just thinking about setting up competitive firms.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have talked about this on this show over the past year, is all the barriers to competition that come into existence, in large part because the big companies want them. And we've talked about minimum wage laws, which is one of the ways that they protect themselves from competition. Otherwise, there'd be people in the inner cities, blacks, where the black unemployment rate in the inner cities is like 40%. They could be out establishing new businesses, where they hire their friends and people in the neighborhood at $2 an hour or whatever. They're not allowed to do that. That protects the big firms, or, all these regulations that they have to comply with when they open up a new business, permits, handicap access, and so forth. It keeps the young upstarts from forming these businesses, and in large part, these big companies love it because that protects them from competition. But and that's why the left sometimes wrongfully accuses libertarians of defending the status quo. So the last thing we're going to do is defend the regulated society, the welfare state and so forth, because we keep arguing that these are the barriers to to letting poor people in the inner cities and so forth, get wealthy by starting businesses and compete. And then, they bring up this argument sometimes, Sheldon, where they say, oh, well, we need to, in the welfare state, we need to take from the rich, the Microsoft or the Google or something, in order to give to the poor. But when you look at a pure unhampered market economy, the type that you and I want, which is free of government control and government manipulation and so forth, you don't need a mandatory confiscatory machine that takes money from the rich and gives it to the poor. For one thing, as you and I have talked about over the year on this show, that's an immoral principle of forcibly taking money from people. But the market itself is a great adjuster of income and wealth. And like I said earlier, if a company doesn't satisfy consumers, it starts losing market share. In fact, if you look at the list of the top 100 companies of, let's say, just 50 years ago, I'm willing to bet that probably none of those 50 companies are in the top 50 anymore, maybe one or two. And why is that? Because of the dynamics of the market process, that consumers taste shift. They start spending their money elsewhere, and the company that was number one today, 10 years down the line, is no longer number one, not even in the top 10. And so I think there's another fallacy of this leftist perspective, that you have to confiscate from the wealthy in order to give to the poor.
Well, I think we need to correct the leftist impression. I think some of what's said is not lacking merit, because we've already said there's a huge constellation of government interventions which are, I think, designed, and even the ones that aren't designed have this as a byproduct, that suppress competition and let companies get bigger and wealthier than they would be otherwise. And like I said, reduce sensitivity to consumers, because if you're sheltered from competition, you don't need to be as sensitive. It doesn't mean you become totally insensitive. You still need people to buy your products. That's going to put some limit on the price and quality. But if there's not free competition, if competition is blocked by the state, then you're going to get the mechanism that makes companies cater to companies consumers will be weakened quite a bit. And so there's some merit in what they say. I don't think we should wholesale reject that leftist analysis. We should point them in the direction of where the abuse, what the source of abuse is, namely the state partnership of business and government. I mean, Adam Smith, throughout the book, is attacking businessmen for basically for rent seeking, not a phrase they had back then, but and he has this famous passage where he says, it's never the case that business people sit down for drink and food, that they don't turn to a conspiracy against the public interest. This is Adam Smith saying this, and the left likes to cite that, except the very next sentence is, there's no way to stop that's consistent with the system of natural liberty. And then he goes on to say in the very next sentence, but government should neither facilitate nor necessitate. Now, what's going on here is the government facilitates through what we call corporatism, through interventions that are designed to become partners with big business in order to protect their position, not to protect consumer sovereignty and competition. So what we need to do with the left is point them in the direction of the real source of the abuses that they, I think, rightly are concerned about.
Well, before we leave this area, I thought we ought to mention that, other examples of monopolies or close to monopoly power. And public schooling is one. In fact, I think, one of our future shows here, we ought to discuss education, especially given your great book that you've done for us, Separating School and State. But it's a semi-monopoly. I mean, yeah, people now can homeschool children. Back in the 50s, they would send them to jail for doing such a thing. And yeah, they're private schools, but they're private licensed schools. They have to operate under government control and supervision. But most people are herded into the government school system, and we can see what that does to people. Shoddy product. By the time a kid reaches 18, he hates learning and so forth. And this is a product of a governmental monopoly, or at least a close monopoly. And the other one's the Federal Reserve System. I mean, here's a classic monopoly with respect to money. And in fact, I'm curious as to how long they're going to be permitting this Bitcoin phenomenon to be going on, because, they hate competition when it comes to money. And the Chinese regime has already said they're not going to permit it. And I wouldn't be surprised to see the U.S. government following the Chinese communist regime in this area, because they all love their little privileged position when it comes to the monetary sphere.
Well, Sam Woolrich, some years ago, wrote a book called Uncle Sam and the Monopoly Man. I mean, what government does is create monopolies. And that book's out of print, but it's well worth finding. So I recommend it. He's got a chapter on the Postal Service there, but also a bunch of others. I mean, that's what government does. It dispenses monopolies, because it gets, if not outright, overt monopolies, then it can still dispense monopolistic power through its competition suppression that we just talked about. So that's what government routinely does, because there's largesse in it. People will pay for it. Patronage is an old story, and you need campaign contributions. You want to get reelected, that's the kind of thing you do. And there are plenty of business people who are lobbying for it and willing to accept those favors. So we shouldn't be surprised by any of that. That's the way it works.
No, it's about money, and it's about power. I mean, behind every one of these little regulations and monopolies and so forth, you're absolutely right. There's going to be a relatively small group of people in terms of the whole population that is benefiting from this largesse, and that, oh, by the way, is putting hundreds of thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars into the pockets of the members of Congress. Now, they don't call it a bribe. They call it a campaign contribution. And that campaign contribution is made during election time, and very rarely is there a formal quid pro quo. I put this money in your pocket, you do something else for me down the line. You give me this privilege, this subsidy or protection from competition. But everybody knows how the language is being spoken here. Everybody's expecting something in return for those campaign contributions. That's the way the system works. And they get it. Because then the congressman says, oh, no, this has nothing to do with the campaign contribution. But he knows that once he grants the little privilege of the largesse, that he's likely to get a big campaign contribution down the line without anybody speaking the words. I thought we ought to wrap up, Sheldon, with some little, resolutions. We've gone through 2013. I think we had a lot of good signs in 2013 from a libertarian perspective. A lot of people are self-identifying as libertarians. They, especially young people. I mean, it's just amazing how many young people are identifying as libertarians. You've got more people than ever questioning the drug war, this evil, immoral government program that continues ruining people's lives. Even statists are now re-examining the people they put in jail for who knows how long, based on just a drug violation. The public opinion stopped President Obama from intervening in Syria. That's a good sign. Public opinion polls reflect that people are not trusting big government. They see this NSA scandal, where the government effectively would love to put a camera in everybody's home to monitor their activity. I think there's a lot of people questioning this NSA and the surveillance thing. And I think that what we need to do is try to continue what we're doing, is raising people's vision to a higher level and that is questioning the whole notion of the national security state, the military empire, the welfare state, the regulated society, so that instead of people doing what conservatives and liberals want them to do, come up with some minor reform of the system, is that we take them to a higher level and say, you don't need these statist systems. For one thing, they're founded on immoral principles, and they're also highly destructive to your economic well-being.
Well, that's right. And as I wrote recently, those are actually one and the same criticisms. Because destroying someone's economic well-being is a moral offense. It's not just a practical offense or some other kind of offense. So we need to teach people that. I see no reason to stop what we're doing because the need is still there, and there are still people out there who haven't heard the message yet. So let's get on to 2014. I'm eager and ready to go.
All right, well, that's the Libertarian Angle for this week and for this year. Thank you for tuning in, and thanks for watching the program over the past year. As y'all probably know, this is our end-of-year fundraising time. This is where we're raising funds to help with our programs in the coming year. I hope you, if you haven't already given, will consider supporting the activities. You support programs like this and our Future Freedom Monthly Journal, our FFF Daily, our webinars, our on-the-road seminars like Sheldon and I did just a couple months ago with the Young Americans for Liberty, our great program we have coming up with the Students for Liberty Conference in February that I hope you all will attend. It's not just limited to students. Our very active op-ed program. We're sharing ideas on liberty with newspapers and websites across the internet and across the country. But we need your support. We cannot do this without the support that y'all give us. So we'd greatly appreciate you. If you haven't already done so, sending us a check or a donation by through our secure website at fff.org. So it's been a great year. Thanks, Sheldon. I greatly enjoyed doing this with you, and look forward to 2014. Thanks so much, and a Happy New Year from everybody here at FFF.